What's my range? Pacing.
Alright, who knows a good joke? Who knows a joke? Something funny. Wake us up. It's after lunch.
That's funny how it works out.
I know a joke.
You know a joke. Alright, Jeff knows a joke.
Two psychiatrists are walking down the hall towards each other. One says to the other, "Hey," and the other guy says, I wonder what he meant by that. It's too deep for after lunch, isn't it?
Alright, go. You didn't want to. Now you want to tell a joke. Go.
Anybody know a good haiku?
Well, what's the one about UDP?
I don't know.
I would tell you.
I tell you a joke about UDP, but you may not get it.
I tell you a joke about UDP. I don't care if you get it or not. Something like that. Get it because. Bad.
Moo.
Is there another one? There's deep version of that. This is Jeff Mann. Jeff, we're lucky because he came a long way. Where'd you come from?
San Francisco.
San Francisco. Well, he was at RSA, but he's from...
I'm from Maryland.
He's from Maryland. I knew all this. Oh, I didn't say it. And he works for... starts with a T. Rhymes with Schmannable. Alright, what are you going to tell us about?
All right, thank you. This is funny because I didn't plan this ahead of time with Eddie, but like half of his slides are half of my slides. So let's think about this talk being going a little bit deeper dive on what Eddie was talking about this morning in terms of the need for us as a community to be able to better communicate. There's my vital statistics and what I used to look like about 15, 20 years ago. Back when I was younger and cooler. That's my passport photo, and yes, I did get pulled aside a lot back in those days. I'm at Mr. Jeff Mann on Twitter. If by the end of the talk you want to get in touch with me, feel free. Talk about securities. We're going to find out. I've been in the business a long time. Actually, I found out last night I've been doing this a year longer than Eddie. No, I'm a year older than Eddie. And I think I have been doing this a year longer than him. So, what makes me a Jedi? I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself just because a lot of you don't know me, and not to brag on myself. This is not about me, just to put it in the context of what I want to talk about today. Defining the problem, which is the need for better communication. Talk about why that is a problem, and talk about how to improve upon that. So hopefully talking a little bit more about the how that Eddie alluded to this morning, and then as time allows, happy to answer questions. So it all began with, I'll throw that out there right now, I began my career with the DoD. Spent the first third of my career working at the Hallowed Hall, so if you want to throw things at me, you can. If you want to talk about Snowden later, we can do that. I actually started out at the NSA as a cryptanalyst. I later became what we called information security analyst. I've worked both sides of the house. Does anybody know that there's two sides of the house at NSA? There's an offense and a defense. I actually spent more time on the defensive side, creating codes, creating secure communication systems. I spent a short amount of time on the offensive side. But on the defensive side, 20-some years ago, 22, 23 years ago, started getting more into network systems, which got us into penetration testing. So I started doing that with vulnerability assessment, so on and so forth. When I started out, that's what I was doing. I was doing paper cryptography. And that thing's a one-time pad. I did a couple of projects with a couple different customers that are DoD customers, and they would use an algorithm, which is what this table is here, called a visionaire table, which is 26 slides of the alphabet against itself. So it's like ROT 1 through ROT 26. And they would memorize what turned out to be 123 unique three-letter combinations that table creates. I didn't have it memorized, so I'd just been through all these cryptanalysis 101 classes learning about cipher wheels. So I invented a visionaire cipher wheel. And the first one I made with graph paper, and I glued it to cardboard, and I cut it out, and I just was using it for myself. But the guys that were my customers, they kept stealing it from me. So we ended up making a bunch of them. The customer happened to be the Special Forces. So to this day, when I run into ex-Special Forces, which I do in my line of work occasionally, I ask them if they've ever heard of this thing. They called it the Whizzy Wheel. In fact, I've got one with me today if anybody wants to see it later on. When I started at NSA, everybody know what that is? Say it out loud. You can talk. This is interactive. It's an Enigma machine. When I started at NSA, it was still a secret that U.S. and its allies had broken the Enigma machine. Why? Because there were still countries using it. It wasn't made public until the late 80s, I believe. Anyway, been about 20 years now. I came out into the private sector. A bunch of us guys that worked together. We were pen testers, and we wanted to go out and conquer the world and teach everybody all about the evil vulnerabilities that are out there, and do it by pen testing and vulnerability assessments and make everything better. So went out into the private sector and did that for a few years. I actually got a little frustrated as a pen tester, and if you're pen testers out there, tell me if you can relate to this. Going into a customer over and over again, 6 months later, a year later, finding the exact same problem that you had found, the previous time you were in there, and they'd never gotten around to fixing it, or there was some business reason why they couldn't fix it. I started to, and this is sort of the beginnings of this talk, I started to get the idea that, okay, just telling them that things are bad alone doesn't change things. Plus there was younger guys that were working with me that were actually, frankly, better pen testers than I was. I was never much more than a script kiddie. But I did like to, once I got onto a box, look at what was on the box in terms of what kind of information was there. And I believe there's a term for this now called pivoting. I'm learning the new dialogue, because for 10 years I've been a QSA, so I got away from the security community. But I went out and started to try to, I think I understand business a little. I was a business major in college. I've been working for the government and had to talk to people in suits. Maybe part of the problem is communication. How do you explain all this complex security stuff to people that don't understand it in a way that they will make the change? Because they're often the decision makers. They're the ones that are going to spend the budget, invest in technology, invest in resources, give you a raise, say, good job, you're doing a great job, keep it up, here's more money, that type of thing. I guess it didn't work because I ended up in PCI. I kind of called that purgatory, but I did it for 10 years. And then Tenable saved me about 2.5 years ago. They brought me in as a PCI subject matter expert and said, we want you to go out and be a strategist and evangelist and go talk about security, which is why I'm here today. I swear Eddie had the same slide this morning. So we all agree things aren't going too well. I actually went around last year giving a talk that was the title of the talk, and I was doing some soul searching because tools that we've used and trusted in for a long time, things like the bash shell, were having vulnerabilities discovered in it. You hear about all these major breaches, and you find out that the breaches are caused by default null passwords, default passwords, trust issues, unknown issues, and I'm like, gosh, that's the stuff that we were doing 20 years ago. Nothing has changed. This is a little bit dated, but these are some of the big names that have been some of the big companies that have been breached in the last year or two or three, and you could fill that slide with many, many more. So, to echo what Eddie was saying, I think the problem is often we don't do a good job of communicating. We have Eddie talked about how we're different and we speak a different language. And I think also we don't always have the opportunity to speak. If you're not accustomed to getting up in front of people, if you're not comfortable with some of the things that Eddie was describing, you may not even try to do it. But I've also, in the last year and a half, as I've been going around to these various security conferences, I've been seeing a lot of, shall I say, attitude, shall I say, ego. And I think this sums it up. This was a meme that was just put out in the Twitterverse in the last week or two. If you consider everybody else stupid but you, probably not going to be an effective communicator when you're trying to communicate to those stupid people that are making the decisions. So part of this talk is really, let's learn to speak better, but also, let's go at it with the right sort of attitude, the right approach. So here's what I'm going to jump into now, and this is movie themed, Art of the Jedi, Mind Tricks, Star Wars, and all that. I want to try to give you some of the techniques that I've learned over the last 20 years of primarily being a consultant, going into hundreds of different companies, having to talk to various levels of management, all the IT people, all the security people, various degrees of acceptance, various degrees of hostility at why, especially when I was in PCI, why am I some dumb auditor coming in, keeping them from their day job, that type of thing. So, the first thing I would say is you need to know your target audience. Eddie was talking about giving examples, speaking their language, and he even gave an example of, how he got a lot of background information on one of his customers. That's great. How do you do that? Well, one way that you can do it is engage them in conversation. Try to find out what some of their interests are. So as an example, as an exercise, I give you some of the movies over the years that are hacker related, and I would ask the audience by show of hands, who thinks Black Hat is the best hacker movie ever? Good. Enemy of the State. I put that up there mostly because it's about where I worked, and the bad guy was my old boss. War Games. Come on, gotta have some hands up. Sneakers. A few more. Sneakers kind of introduced social engineering in a fun way. How about Hackers? I actually watched that on Netflix last week because I haven't seen it probably since it came out 20-some years ago. It was a nice stroll down memory lane because when I started pen testing, it was over a 14.4 modem. Firewall? Anybody even seen that one? It's got firewall in the name. Or Swordfish.
Swordfish.
Other than Halle Berry. Hacker film.
Oh, come on. 1024-bit firewall?
Yeah, come on. All right, so throwing up... Yes.
Oh.
Yes, I did. Do you think that was the best hacker movie ever made? All right. I believe you. Well, so that's a little bit about me. I didn't think it was worthy of the list, but a little exercise like that can give you an idea of, if you're speaking to a large audience or small audience, you're getting a feel for where they're coming from, what their mindset is. Like War Games is sort of the classic hacker mentality. How do you approach a problem, kind of stumble upon something? Sneakers, social engineering, so on and so forth. This is essential. If you're going to get to know your audience, if you're going to understand where they're coming from, as you're gathering ammunition for how to speak to them and looking for strategies, it's really important to listen. Again, movie theme. So we're going to play Name That Movie. Field of Dreams. Very good. It can be as simple as you're trying to explain something. Just simply ask the question, what did you just hear me say? And let them repeat back to you what they've heard. Very often you will find you think you're here, they're way over here. So you need to try again. Well, let's try something different. This all means learning to speak their language. I've seen a bunch of talks, even at HackerCons, talking about this problem of communication. And a lot of times I hear techniques on how to dumb it down, how to get them to understand your terminology. I'm a strong believer and advocate of you need to put it in terms that they can understand. And that means learning to speak a different language. There's a little bit of that humility in there as well, because it may take a while to learn their language. You may not want to learn their language. It's not technically a movie. Everybody's seen that commercial? No? Maybe it's a regional thing. Frog insurance. Frog protection. Yeah, we're from the same place. Frog protection. We're on the same page. Learn to tell stories. And again, if you've gotten to know your audience, whether it's a large audience or small, and you're learning a little bit about them, that might give you a clue on what type of stories to tell. I tell a lot of movie things. I guess I'm a movie buff. We used to talk about, how insecure an environment was by referring to Blazing Saddles. Has anybody seen the movie Blazing Saddles? The toll booth in the desert. Sometimes that's your only defense. You've got great protection, but you're wide open around. Maybe the person's a sports buff, or more importantly, maybe they don't care about sports. So, team analogies, sports analogies don't always play. I've found often in my international travels, as I'm trying to explain things to the audience, my customer, I'll start using, phrases or idioms that all of a sudden as I'm speaking, I realize, wow, that's a real American thing, and they probably have no idea what I'm talking about. So if I can catch myself, I try to stop and try to think or ask them simply, what does it mean if I say this? And explain what it means. How would you say that in your dialect, in your area? And try to, again, put it in terms that they understand, speak their language. Anybody got the movie? Big Fish, very good. Here's an example. I'm a cryptanalyst by trade, and I could, talk to you about elliptic curves and all sorts of, high primes and random number generators and things like that. Cryptanalysis came in handy, password cracking back in the day and stuff like that. But when I'm trying to explain to an audience how cryptography works, and symmetric, asymmetric, especially in the payment space, I just break it down like this. There's something that you have that you're trying to protect, and there's some fancy math stuff that you add to it with some random secret stuff, the key, and that produces something. I presented this last year, and a woman came up to me afterwards and said, I've just gone through the CISSP training, but I learned more from you than I did in the whole training course. Just because you throw out terms doesn't mean people understand it. And even if you think you're simplifying the terms, they don't often understand it. So break it down as much as you can. This should go out without saying, and I think Eddie referred to this a little bit, but if you're working for a company, understand the company's in business. It's probably in business for profit. There's drivers. There's things that are going to pique the ears of your audience, the listener, the managers, the management. Learn to put things in their terms, but again, listen to what they're saying. Listen to what their drivers are. I used to go into customers and just simply ask the different groups that I'd be talking to, especially when I got to the security folks. I'd ask them, what's making you lose sleep at night? What do you worry about? Because you know your environment much better than I'm going to learn in the week or two that I'm here. And especially in the PCI world, I would tell them, this is how I would win favor with them. If there's something you need, tell me about it. I'll slap PCI on it. A, we'll be friends, and you'll tell me a lot more. But B, you'll get it. Because if your boss, who doesn't understand any of this, just hears PCI, there's a blank check. And they know they want to do the compliance. They have to do the compliance thing. You get what you need. Worked like a charm, more often than you'd imagine. Oh, I'm sorry. What was the movie? Thank you. All right. And again, get feedback. People used to call me an auditor in the PCI space. I called myself an assessor. I've never done an audit, but people thought I was an auditor. I would explain that to them once, but if they still wanted to call me an auditor, I wasn't going to argue with them. Is it a vulnerability scan or is it a vulnerability audit? I don't care what term we use, but let's agree on the definition of the term. Just work your way through the language barrier and try to get to a point of understanding. And don't think that they always have to come to you. You can speak in their language, put it in terms that they're used to and they're comfortable with. If you're getting decisions made, just a valuable lesson, life lesson, especially if your job is on the line, get it in writing. And realize that you're not always going to get what you want. There isn't always you have the idea of what the perfect solution is, but there's probably more than one way to skin the cat. I just used an expression that people may or may not understand, especially in England. So be prepared to lose, compromise. Find that middle ground. Movie? This is the trick one. Long Kiss Goodnight. Good job. You're getting there. Yep, too slow. Which the line in that movie is, don't make an assumption because it makes an ass out of you and umption. The other thing, and I've seen this very often and I've heard it in various talks, things are bad. Things are really, really bad. But you don't want to always necessarily, especially when you're trying to get to a point where you're going to need things to be changed and money needs to be spent, investments need to be made, ease into it. So a rule of thumb that I used to do when I was doing the presentations of, after the vulnerability assessment, after the compliance assessment, start off with some good things. And sometimes it was a stretch. Well, your website has lots of pretty colors. It's a nice website to visit. And then start getting into, but, there was a few bad things, and then, oh, by the way, there was that devastating thing that got us into the entire application, which got us into your entire network. So ease into it. Movie? It's real easy. Very good. It's kind of right there for you. I unfortunately learned this life lesson from my father, and this is probably something that's tortured me my whole life, because I never got straight A's as a kid, but one time I came home with like 6 A's and a B. And the first thing my dad said to me was, well, why'd you get a B? So I've always remembered that, and so I've always tried to give that to my customers, ease into it. Say, good job, attaboy, but. So that's the fast version of some techniques, but things that I've learned over the years of how to communicate to audiences large and small, especially when there's discussion going on and decisions need to be made. So, this is where we are, maybe? Matrix. Things are bad. We all agree things are bad. Communication is difficult. We all agree things are difficult. So maybe, do you want to dive in and experience the reality of how difficult it is to communicate and get across, and especially to your audience, or do you want to just keep bopping along? Some might feel this way. Movie? War Games, good job. The conclusion of the War Games movie was, well, this is a silly game to play, thermonuclear war, so why don't we do something different? I've always talked about security. A lot of people talk about it being a game, but I kind of think of it as a puzzle, and I think it's from my DoD training, my analyst training. There's a solution out there. There might be multiple solutions out there. The trick is to get everybody in agreement. This is the path to go. This is where we want to go in terms of where we want to be. Unfortunately, we don't have the option of not playing. But it's difficult. And it takes time. And it takes an investment. And if it wants you first, don't succeed, try again. Because it's hard to sometimes steer the culture of a company, the culture of an industry, frankly. Movie. Wrong! So, in summary, in terms of good communication skills, I guess the first thing I would say is look for opportunities to practice. I used to, sitting around the dinner table with my family, I'd bore them a lot, but I'd talk about work and talk about the things that I was encountering, and I would try to explain them, the concepts and the things that I was encountering. I'd try to explain it to my wife and kids, who are pretty much a non-technical audience. And I always felt like if I could get it through to them, then I was on the right track. I was ready to go out and speak to the customer. So look for opportunities to practice, try again. Realize that you're really learning to speak a different language when you're learning to speak the language of your audience. So I used to describe myself as being bilingual. I could speak the language of management. I could speak the language of the tech. Any questions? What did you hear me say? What have you heard in my message today? Questions, comments, war stories? wake up. All right, very good. This is the last bit. I'm going to be back here this summer, and I'm actually putting together a training course to give people an opportunity to practice speaking techniques, to practice communication skills, because we don't always get a chance to do that. So, hope to see you in June. All right, thank you.